All right. What's up, Jim?
How you doing, Jared? Good to see you.
Doing
It's
good,
Friday.
man. We have a special guest. Yes, Friday.
Friday, we've got a special guest here on the Dangerous Great Books, right? So first, though, what are you reading, Jared?
So this week I actually picked up a Zizek essay in what's it called? Critics and Critique, I think is what it is.
Yeah.
Crisis and Critique.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called The Hologram of Conflicting Universalities. It's pretty interesting. It's kind of his take on what transcultural capitalism has caused in regard to universalities. So kind of interesting.
I don't know. Maybe that one warrants an episode. I don't know.
It's pretty good. Yeah.
Zizek should be on our radar. So, and I think an
How about
essay
you?
would be good for him. What have I been reading? So, okay, so I'm having my life changed by Deleuze's Difference in Repetition. Okay, I've gone down a rabbit hole, as it were, with that book this week, and continuing to plug my way through a series of unfortunate events in my reading project there. So yeah, but it's been a pretty big Deleuze week for me. So nice, and I think we've talked about this before, Jared. I think Deleuze is going to be on our radar for the show at some point here. So
probably multiple episodes. Yeah.
But as we mentioned, we have a special guest this week. The listeners are the legions, though I should note, we now have over 100 followers. Okay.
So, yay.
Yeah. So the legion of dozens has reached the century point. Okay. And so we have a special guest this week. Our special guest is Kelly Chase, a friend of mine. Kelly, for a while, hosted a podcast called The UFO Rabbit Hole, on which I appeared several times. And it's now simply Cosmosis. Is that right, Kelly?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you should think of Kelly as like the Renaissance woman of the weird, is how I would describe her. Kelly.
Nice.
Okay? So Kelly wrote a book about the UFO phenomenon based on a lot of her episodes. If you ever listen to a podcast by Kelly, her episodes are mostly pre-written, right, Kelly? Like, so that she's basically writing essays and producing like really academic work about this. Okay. But so she's had that podcast. She has a new podcast co-hosted with Jay, right? Okay. She's been co-producer, I guess we'll call it, on a television series, Cosmosis, right? Is part of the team that runs a media company called Cosmosis that's branching out all sorts of areas. Recently had a foray into an academic conference in Britain, right? Okay, so and we brought Kelly in to talk about a book that would fall into what's called Ufology, and maybe we'll get into what that is and isn't. But I think Kelly would agree with me that like her vision is to move beyond like that kind of narrow limit and to really become this sort of Renaissance woman of the weird, right? Is that all fair to say about you, Kelly?
No, that's very fair and very kind. I appreciate that. My work has progressively moved into just the space of general weirdness. I said about the UFO rabbit hole for a while that it became a UFO podcast where we never talked about UFOs. But I'm still fascinated by the UFO because I think it's an entry point for asking some of the most interesting questions we have to ask about the nature of our reality and who we are and where we are and all of that. So it's still central and from a spiritual sense, but I'm less interested in like the physical craft.
Yeah. And Kelly, I don't know if you've listened to the last couple episodes, but what we've been doing is, so for instance, last week we looked at Freud's Uncanny, right? What did we do the week before that, Jared?
Lovecraft.
We did Lovecraft. Okay. And in each case, what we emphasize in the episode is when we approach the weird space, we cannot just take the surface phenomenon at face value, right? And that's sort of the bait, I think, that people fall into. Okay. And I think for Jared and I, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jared, is what's really important for us is we cannot give our own unconscious a pass when we deal with the weird, right? Like we have to look at what is the unconscious contribution to our investment in these kinds of things. Okay. And before we can take the weird seriously, we have to like really get to the point where we can like trust ourselves, right? To have a mistrust for ourselves in approaching it, right? And that's why, and I know, you, Kelly, and I have spoken many, many times. I think that's something important to Kelly. That's why we wanted to talk about this book, Messengers of Deception by Jacques Vallee, which is, I think, a great object study in I think, both how that message can be announced and systematically unheard in a field of the weird, right? So, yeah. And so, Kelly, what I know you're very familiar with Valet's book. Can you maybe start with some background on the text at all?
Yeah. So I think Messengers of Deception, to me, is one of the most important books in the field of ufology, but I think that it's about so much more than that, and that it should be read by people outside of the field. It's really valuable. I think that people need to start with understanding who Jacques Vallee is. And he's this guy who really has been at the bleeding edge of the future, of what humanity is becoming in more ways than one. His interest in ufology is kind of, I think even to this day, he would describe as kind of his silly little hobby on the side, and not necessarily, it's the focus of great inquiry for him, but it's not really what he sees as his life's work. This is someone who is a computer scientist and has played a large role in kind of the creation of the internet and the conceptualizing of what our world is going to look like moving into a more interconnected future. And but I think that you need to understand all of these things together with Valet, because what he's really talking about in his books is partly about the weirdness of this phenomenon, but I think he's also very often talking about the ways in which our basic ways of apprehending and understanding our world are deeply flawed, that we're very epistemically vulnerable as human beings, and that we're a lot more easy to manipulate than we think. And I would say, he never says this explicitly, but I think what comes through in his work is this idea that this manipulation isn't something that happens kind of like incidentally or sometimes or in certain cases, but that it's in many ways kind of the default setting for the reality that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think that a lot of people are reading him that deeply and in that way, but I believe very strongly that that's how he intends to present and what the world that he's trying to point to.
Yeah, 100%. Jared mentioned that he read an essay by Zizek recently. And, one of the things that a lot of us have learned from Zizek, who, is the sort of Slovenian madman of contemporary philosophy, is that ideology does not operate consciously. It operates in the unconscious. And I think you're getting something very close to that in Valet's Messengers of Deceptions. Is like he's kind of outing how there are ideological structures operating in the unconscious background of the UFO phenomenon, right? Which leads to, I think, also to very interesting ambiguities as to what is Valet actually up to. So, Kelly, I think you would agree too, is like a lot of times when people want to cite the legitimacy of the study of the UFO, they'll cite Jacques Vallee. I've done the same thing. Because he has a doctorate in France, right, in astronomy, or some kind of advanced degree in astronomy from France, and he has a PhD from, Northwestern University in computer science, right? So he's a highly credentialed scientist who took this stuff very seriously in some ways, written several books about it. But also, he seems to think that there's something very sketchy about a lot of the classic UFO cases, right? And what you get partly in Messengers of Deception from like the dean of UFO studies is he goes through a lot of the classic cases, including like Roswell, right? And comes out saying, I think this may have been staged, right? I mean, and he actually goes through a case, I believe it's in France, where he's pretty convinced that French intelligence staged a UFO abduction, right? And he talks about all sorts of stuff in like South America, et cetera, et cetera. So it's interesting thing with Valet, like he writes some earlier things that really motivate the reality of the UFO, but then he comes back with this book to say, be careful, right? Be careful, because it does seem that there's a lot of chicanery that goes on with this, right? So I think that, like, after I read this book, I came away with this very ambiguous attitude towards Jacques Vallee, right? That the right hand and left hand are like giving and taking. Yeah.
Yeah, I posted about messengers of deception because I was thinking about this conversation that was coming up, and I did mention at some point in a reply that I don't find Valet to be a particularly reliable narrator, and people were kind of like horrified and confused by the fact that I said that. But I think that that's another understanding that we have to bring to Jacques Vallee, is that like this is a man who almost certainly has held and almost certainly still holds clearances. I would eat my hat if he doesn't, right? The things that he's been involved in, the company that he keeps, from the UFO side into his, more mainstream work, it all has him bumping up against some of the most secretive projects that the government has undertaken over the last several decades, and all of them, I would argue, come back to major mechanisms of control that are utilized against us, against the human population, by our government, and that he has a really deep understanding of those things. I don't think that it's fair to like reduce the phenomenon to that, but he does point out aggressively, and I think in Messengers of Deception a lot, the way that there is this kind of mimicry between the way that the phenomenon controls and manipulates us and the way that we have been controlled and manipulated by human beings, sometimes under the guise of the phenomenon.
Yeah.
And but the thing is about having all of those clearances, being somebody like that, is that he can't just tell you what's happening, right? He's always pointing. He's always kind of like telling you a story where it seems kind of boring, but then you're like, oh wait, something in here actually doesn't make sense. And actually, I think you were someone who helped me understand, Jim, that so many people who write in this space their work is redacted. It's heavily redacted, but if you know how to look for the redactions, if you understand what the redactions are, then suddenly you are able to paint a bigger picture. And I think Valet is like famous for that, for kind of telling part of the story, for telling something that's a little apocryphal, for like combining something or And so I don't find him to be particularly reliable, but I think if you're educated on his work, that you can still find a lot of value there.
Yeah, Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I kind of read this is sort of like he's gone back into the cave of Plato's cave, and he's pointed out the fact that there actually are shadow makers, and that some people that are in the cave that are chained up also have unconscious, psychological realities that are giving those shadows certain forms, right? Yes. So I see this kind of as a sociological text of, things are there, but they're not exactly what we've been told, maybe. Or there's also a subconscious reality that's going on, a kind of cult-like reality that's going on that spreads this message in a way that we just need to be aware of, right? Yeah. That it's just kind of opening our eyes to the fact that maybe it's not everything we've been told, but there is something going on,
Can I do two passages where I think he just lays out his thesis really, really clearly? Okay.
Yeah, please.
And the one on page 20, he's like, clearly he's doing that, right? He italicizes this. This is on page 20 of Messengers of Deception, which, by the way, just it came out in 1979, which I think is an interesting time. But anyway, so quoting Valet, I propose that the UFO we see is, among other things, a device which creates a distortion of the witness's reality. That it does so for a purpose, which is to project images or fabricated scenes designed to change our belief systems, and that the technology we observe is only the incidental support for a worldwide enterprise of subliminal seduction. End quote. Okay, and then if you go to page 178 towards the end, okay, sorry. Okay, so this is the end of part 2 on page 178. Valet says, I don't think we should expect salvation from the sky. I believe there is a very real UFO problem. I have also come to suspect that it is being manipulated for political ends, and the data suggests that the manipulation may be human beings with a plan for social control. Such plans have been made before and have succeeded. History shows that having a cosmic mythology as part of such a plan is not always necessary, but it certainly helps. End quote. Okay. All right. And so, I think once you've seen like just that, it's very hard to think that Jacques Vallee is someone that can be read at a surface level in all his other work about ufology, right? And maybe everything else, right? Because he is saying something out there is kind of spoiling the epistemic stew, right? that we don't have an unmediated access to this phenomenon. And I would say we don't have an unmediated access to anything. Okay. But he's saying like the UFO is not an exception to that. And it is like our access to this is being mediated through systems of information control, data control, social control, et cetera, et cetera. And he's clearly saying he thinks the phenomenon itself is a vehicle of those very structures, right? A vehicle, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important. And I think I'm glad you talked about the fact that it was published in 1979. I think very relevant to those passages that you just read is the fact that Jacques Vallee has said that you shouldn't trust any UFO cases or like abduction cases before 1975. I mean, sorry, after 1975. Yeah. And, I think that the implications there, and, for people who have done a lot of kind of deeper research into what the government has been capable of and the sorts of things that they were experimenting on in, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there is this kind of implication that that they might have the ability to manufacture or fake some of these the aspects of these encounters that people have with UFOs or with non-human intelligences. I think for people who are less initiated into the UFO world, it's important to know that a very important and under talked about aspect of these encounters is that it completely transforms people. It transforms their belief systems. It transforms the ways that they think about themselves and the greater cosmos, their everything. It can really, it's such an ontological rupture in someone's world that you almost have to stitch it back together with some kind of a story. And that makes it really easy to then rewire somebody. And I think he means this quite literally. There's a researcher, Colm Kelleher, who was one of the early skinwalker investigators and has been involved in a lot of this for quite some time. And he did a talk at Archives of the Impossible where he talked about bidirectional mimicry. And the example that he used was that it's just accepted for people who aren't as initiated. It's just accept that people in ufology basically accept that the black triangle UFOs are some kind of reverse engineered technology, but it's human technology, right? The problem being that there were all kinds of sightings of these black triangle UFOs flying low and slow over residential areas or over highways in the middle of the day in front of, crowded highways and that sort of thing.
And so we mean like many reports of that. I think.
Oh yeah. Very common.
Yeah. Very common. Yeah.
One of the most common kinds. And so then the question becomes, if this is our secret technology, like that's just not how we behave with our technology. And his argument is that we reverse engineered their technology to create these black triangles, but then that they are now showing people these black triangles in the sky as like that they're basically mimicking us back. But I think that happens with far more than just like how these things represent materially or technologically. I think that we are also, or the powers, that there are certain powers that be that are manipulating us in the ways that this phenomenon has manipulated us, that it has learned what works and what can be done to a human being to make them completely abandon their belief system and adopt a new one.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've noted, okay, so like this notion of like the word ontological shock gets thrown around quite a bit in discussions of UFOs and things like that, right? And for what that phrase actually originally meant when like Paul Tillich coined it, and as like a reader of Heidegger, I mean the notion of ontological shock was to say like one came to realize like the utter contingency of all of our stories about things, right? Like one came to see that the human conception does not seem to be the measure of things, and so now there's this sort of sense of utter groundlessness of all of our practices, our narratives, our myths, et cetera, right? And I find it interesting how, like, in that sense, how unontologically shocking most reports of UFOs are, right? It's like, okay, so that there's like a different kind of like aircraft is weird and like maybe would be distressing, that there might be a history of technology that we're not privy to, that there's like gray aliens or what have you, it would be weird, but it's not, but it doesn't fundamentally question like ontology, right? It doesn't change the categories of being, right? And that sounds to me like maybe what's going on with a lot of this is people are having truly uncanny, not necessarily in the Freudian sense that we've talked about, but having truly uncanny experiences, and something that Jared hinted at earlier, and then just grabbing things that are in like the human, imaginary, like available images and just throwing that on this, right? And I think this goes to your point, Kelly, that once you like if you do cause a legitimate ontological shock, like you've caused people to realize, hey, it looks like we don't get anything right about the world, right? They are going to be vulnerable for whatever is slithering by in the unconscious, right? To put some hold on that, right? And that's my read on a lot of these phenomena now. Is I think people do hit something that makes no sense whatsoever to like any common human story, and then now they are open to suggestion of things from their own unconscious or things from whatever could be like seeded into the popular culture, et cetera, right? And Valet, I want to go to a passage here on page 48. This is one of my like real eye openers in this. On page 48, Valet says, the link between the images of the UFO world and those of human folklore resides in the psyche. The technology of UFOs is not designed to carry little men from one physical planet to another. It is designed much more simply to trigger the already existing imagery we are all carrying in our brains. It is the imagery of Magonia, of intelligent beams of light, dialogues with strange creatures, emerging fully armed into our local universe, like Athena being born from Zeus's head. The UFOs do nothing more than provide the physical support for our own dreams, end quote. Okay. That I think is an important thing. It seems like what Valet is saying here is whatever's behind this phenomenon is good at tapping into the human unconscious, right? And like giving physical support, giving external affirmation of fantasies that we are inclined to unconsciously, right? Does that make sense? And I think that may explain a lot of like just the transformative nature of this is like, it's like what you've been unconsciously looking for all along suddenly gets affirmed to you.
Yeah, I think that's a real danger. I mean, it's something that like in the work that I've done, I see all the time because, I've kind of been in the business of shaking people's Etch-a-Sketch. And, that was really where I started with the UFO rabbit hole, was making the case that like that I don't know what's going on here, but something's going on here. And it's far stranger than, we had been led to believe. And that as a result, reality is far stranger than we've been led to believe. And people, that can be really fun and exhilarating, that process of kind of opening up and there's suddenly inquiry and the world is reenchanted in a certain way, but it's also can be deeply destabilizing. And, it's really tough when people are coming out of that and trying to figure out, I've had to, and I talk to other people in this work who do similar things, like you have to be careful and be ethical about how you're even engaging with these people, because people become so porous and so open to suggestion and to any kind of a story that's going to put their world back together again in a way that makes sense. And, I think that the real message of Valet and the lesson of ufology, if you're brave enough to take it, is that you don't get to put it back together again and remain intellectually honest, or even more important, I would say, intellectually sovereign.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point, Kelly, because like it could be like who says after an ontological shock you ever get an ontology back, right?
Right.
Do you see what I mean? Or really there's always the risk that you're just going to fall back into another kind of prepackaged in the unconscious ideological structure, right? It'll feel new, but it's not, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think of Freud's use of either going to go into a stone age or into madness. right? So it's a return to a previous age, and sometimes in certain circles, things like demons get attached to these images or to these appearances that happen. It's like, well, yeah, that's a medieval way of being able to explain certain phenomena that within a certain structure does make sense, but whether or not that's true is the real question, right? Of whether or not that's actually what's going on. It's an easy tag to put on some of these things.
The way I always put it, it's not as if the concept of demon was ideologically innocent either, right? Mm-hmm. It's not right. That wasn't mediated through a historical moment that had purposes, et cetera, right? And I think there's this real, okay, and I don't think Valet is denying it, right? And I'm not denying it. I don't think you two are, that there's a real that people are bumping into it in this thing,
for sure,
right? The thing that I think is missing from all these conversations is a mistrust of our identifications of what that real is, right? And an unwillingness to like sit with the fact that maybe all of our identifications of it like are not trustworthy, right? Yeah, right. I mean, and so like here's another passage from the text that I found. Like this is where I think he makes an almost Zizhakian point. Okay, it's on page 55. Valet says, you can find scholars who will, quote, prove to you that the supernatural powers of Jesus never existed. You can also find scholars who will, quote, prove to you that they did exist. Does it matter? Of course not. It only matters to the experts who have staked their academic reputations on either side of the argument. The effect of the belief in Jesus, the impact of the doctrine based on the story of his life and death are real enough. Socially, historically, the consequences are beyond question. I claim that the same now applies to flying saucers because enough people believe in them. Enough people believe that contact with them is possible. Enough people even believe that they have secretly achieved such contact, end quote. Okay. I mean, what he's saying there is like, it's okay. We could pretend something into existence that then gets out of hand and now goes on its own. This is what I mean by a hyperobject, right? Okay. We could pretend something in existence, and I'm not weighing in on the biblical debate or anything like that, right? But we could pretend something in existence and then be stuck with it, and it's up and running, and it has real effect now, okay? And I think this is clear what he's saying with the UFOs. It could be that much of this has been pretended into existence, either accidentally or intentionally, and now it's up and running. It has a kind of cognitive life of its own. It's in the unconscious, right? And like anyone who's like tried to talk about this topic in a serious way and wants to like bracket whether or not a UFO is literally a spacecraft or literally little green men or what have you, will run into this. Because like no matter what, it goes back to, oh, so you're talking about aliens, right? Oh, so you're talking about spacecraft. And the point is I don't know what we're talking about, right? But it doesn't matter because the ideological germ is in the unconscious now, right? And it's going to have an effect, right? As Zizek likes to put it in the Lacanian way, the big other may not exist, but it still insists. It still has an effect, right?
Yeah, no, I think all of that is really important, and I think it also points to. I really do think that, and I know that we've talked about this before, Jim, but, in some ways, Valet is the godfather of modernity, and this like kind of new world that we're moving into, a willing one or not. I think you could argue that he's not, but he's certainly somebody who's had a front row seat for a lot of it. And, the stuff that you guys even talk about on this show, something that I found really interesting recently is that I didn't realize, and maybe this is new, maybe everybody knows this, but I didn't know that Sigmund Freud and Edward Bernays were related. I believe they were like uncle and nephew.
Oh, really? Yeah,
I had no
who Edward Bernays is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had no idea. So for people who aren't familiar, Bernays is kind of the father of modern PR and really of mass public manipulation of sentiment and opinion. He kind of invented that, or at least popularized it, and shared that stuff widely. And so all of this stuff was happening at the same time that Valet is writing this book. This is recounting, him going around to these tiny little UFO groups in the 60s and 70s. just because he was interested, he wanted to talk to these contactees, and it was these fringe little groups, and it wasn't like the internet was around. And, the people that he would run into at these events would be like extraordinarily high level members of the military intelligence apparatus.
And let's explain what these events are. We're talking about like UFO conferences at like at like a shady Motel 6 in like rural Arkansas, right?
Yeah, or like a back room at a library somewhere, or like your local diner, and it's like 10 guys, and
local guys, right?
right. And yet you would find these like high level military intelligence guys that, like, what are they doing?
What are they doing there?
And you see that still now, like this investment. And I guess I'm going with all of this is that when we became a more interconnected species, it opened up this doorway for us to be manipulated, not just on like an individual level or like in one little community, but through these like vast networked communities. And the power of that, I think, really can't be underestimated. And that there were people at that time who, like, that's really what they were thinking about, and that they're still thinking about. And when you start to understand, like, what's been disturbing for me is I was a marketer before all of this. And I used to joke, because it would get a laugh at the, marketing conferences, that marketing was psychology for sociopaths. But I really believe that now. And I'm glad to have gotten out of it, because I think that they're like when you start to understand how like personal individual psychology and marketing techniques and PR and think tanks and all of these things are, and then the intelligence community, the actual tactics that the intelligence community uses to gain people's trust, to infiltrate communities and to influence opinion, like they're the same thing. It's the exact same playbook. It's the exact same mechanisms. They are all painfully easy. They're easy and simple to the point that like no one wants to believe that it could work on me. Right? Like there's no way. Like maybe other people it works on them, but it can't possibly
Everyone
work
else
on
has
me.
been unconscious, but Jim Madden.
Right.
I'm in perfect control. Yeah.
And so I really think what he's talking about is he's saying something very important about the UFO community and the extent to which it's been manipulated and turned upside down against itself. But he's also, I think, saying something larger about our society as a whole. And, he's using the microcosm to show the macrocosm.
And let me this is a gem from the book, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, I'm all like,
oh no, please.
I'm doing this like close read of Valet. It's fun. Okay, so I'm on page 68. At the top, he says, based on what you can observe, you have no way to know the truth, even if you have a Nobel Prize in physics. Besides, your television set influences you in other ways. It determines what toothpaste you use, how you shave, who you go to bed with, and how you will vote in the next election. In some respects, I think UFOs are similar to television sets. They are physical objects, the products of technology. They are also something else, the tools of a major cultural change. I think UFOs are perpetuating a deception by presenting their so-called occupants, and he puts occupants in scare quotes, as being messengers from outer space, and I suspect that these are groups of people on Earth exploiting this deception. End quote. Yeah, I mean, there he said it, right?
Yeah.
And I have in like something else, my work on this, I called Valet I see what Valet is doing, because I don't think we mentioned this, but like he was very integral in the development of the internet, right? At least that's the story, right? He was very like integral in the Defense Department, or the contracting the Defense Department developed the internet, right? I actually see like Valet as like the Oppenheimer of the internet, right? In the way that Oppenheimer, like, he got into this thing, that he got like into making this piece of technology, and it was never clear to him why he was doing it. And he unleashes it on the world, and he's like, oh my gosh, I'm death, right? Like, what have we done? But yet he did it, right? And he knew it was coming, right? And he knew precisely what a world changing, not for the better, this thing is. And that's how I interpret like Valet's work, is he sees the internet as even maybe even a bigger threat to humanity, of a different kind of threat, right? And he's saying, oh my gosh, what have we done here? Like, where is this going to go? What is this going to do to humanity in terms of our ability to think for ourselves, in terms of our ability to actually keep our own unconscious at bay, et cetera, et cetera. And I think he's seeing it. And I think for him, in a lot of ways, the UFO might just be a metaphor, not just a metaphor. It might be a metaphor and maybe more else for that, right? For the fact that we've got this like technological tiger by the tail now, that is the internet, that is digital technology, and is going to so fundamentally change things, right, in ways that will undermine like our very sense of what it was to be a human subject, right, and leave us as the playthings of these manipulations of our unconscious, right. That's how I read Valet's like overall, right. Yeah.
So I'd be interested to hear from Kelly. Does Valet have a hypothesis, or in your work, have you seen the hypothesis of why this kind of manipulation? Like why images? Why these flying saucers? Why, a continuation of the narratives of some of these experiences that people claim to have had? It's to me, it's to what end? And maybe I'm thinking too rationally about it, that there may not actually be an end for it other than just trying to confuse. But is there a hypothesis there as to why?
I think that he argues in a lot of different ways about that. I think that in general, it has to do with a couple of things. I think one is, and I actually think this has been really illuminated well by Diana Pasulka in her work in American Cosmic, in particular, and also in Encounters, is that like it has to do with the power of images. That, for whatever reason, sight is our most important sense in a way. Like, I mean, there are people who would argue that, but even going back to the Enlightenment, part of the place I think we got ourselves a little bit in trouble in the Enlightenment is this idea that like seeing is believing, right? Like just hearing something isn't enough, feeling something isn't enough. Like really, you have to, if you see it though, you can say, I saw it. So I saw it with my own two eyes, right? And so I think that there's something about it, the power of images on the human mind, and that we, I think, really underestimate, especially growing up in the culture that we all have, where we're living so saturated in images that we don't understand that like an image is literally putting something into your brain. Like you're not just reading a book, you are taking an image into your brain, and that we as a species our entire culture, our ways of communicating, all of it, and the things that we value most and that we prize as being the most accurate, it's all mitigated by images. And so I think that is part of it. But I think that the reason that this has been used and that it's because like it's effective. I think this has kind of always been the story with us. I think if you look at something I found really interesting is that there's an economist named George Lowenstein. I believe he's at Carnegie Mellon. But he wrote back in, I believe, the 90s. He did some work on the psychology of curiosity and trying to figure out what actually happens in somebody's brain. And he identified these triggers. I probably won't remember them all, but there's 4 triggers for involuntarily inducing curiosity in someone. And this would make people so curious that they would actually like bribe the people who are administering the test to give them the answer, even though they could have gotten the answer for free after the test. And like some of the ways to involuntarily trigger this curiosity are presenting people with a sequence of events with an unclear ending. It's the introducing of something like absurd that doesn't make sense in a situation without like showing them how that's going to resolve. And it's also the idea that someone knows something that you do not. And so I think that like the UFO kind of perfectly does all of these things. It engages the human being. It captures us. It literally hijacks our nervous system along the same reward centers as like sex and drugs and chocolate. Like and it captures you. And I think it also serves then as that kind of initiation event, that call to adventure in the hero's journey. It gives people this, it kind of wakes people up, and it gives them this feeling that they are at the center of the story and that important things are about to happen. And I think people are very programmable in that state. And I think that you can make them believe all kinds of new things about the world around them and about themselves that they wouldn't have been as willing to believe without the introduction of this thing that kind of like ruptures their expectations of the real.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think that the way I'm hearing that also is kind of an invitation to a certain type of Gnosticism. That it's kind of unending, like I'm not against all the Gnostics by any means, but I think that there is a certain kind of Gnosticism seeking secret language or secret knowledge that can end up being your entire lifetime's journey towards some kind of never ending story, versus a Gnosticism of like self-care and certain aspects of that. But that's really interesting to kind of invite people into that without giving them a certain direction of where to go. That's really interesting.
I love that Jared just did. I'm not a Gnostic, but when I do.
Right?
Exactly.
We all do a little. We can't help it.
But I do dabble. It's kind of hard to resist, actually. Like to want to be in on the real thing that no one else is. It's
exactly.
Yeah. I look at that, a lot of that, not surprisingly, to this sort of like psychoanalytic lens of death drive. Okay, and that. The fact that, okay, there's this thing that you don't know and you're constantly defeated in your attempts to know it, then becomes utterly addictive, right? Like the most dissatisfying thing that could happen to ufology is that they found out what it is. Okay, because then what would be left? What would be the unattained object that causes desire for them, right? It's the Lacanian thing that like what we most want is not to get what we want, because then we would be left utterly lifeless, right? And that we're kind of hooked in our own defeat, ever chasing the thing that we feel like we had but we never did have, right? And I really think the UFO thing really taps that. Like one, you get the esoteric, like I'm in on the real thing, but you never get the real thing, right? So it satisfies this sort of like need or desire to have like a Gnostic elitism, but then it also satisfies this like this desire to get in our own way, right? This desire for defeat, this desire to like encounter an enjoyment of a lack, right? I really think that the UFO phenomenon is a great example of seeing that in real time, of how we can get sucked into that, right?
Yeah.
And also, like any Lacanian, I'll say, I'm not denying that there's a das Ding, a thing that we're desiring in this. That okay, but once again, though, we have to look at how easily that puts us vulnerable to ideological manipulation, right?
Yeah, I think what's really important too is I think that there's a way in which people don't want to move on, or they get stuck before the kind of integration phase. I think that everybody at some point, like, you have this impossible thing happen to you, and now you have to grapple with it. And in some way you have to integrate this back into your reality and into your person. But I think a lot of people get stuck there and can get kind of hijacked there, not just by nefarious others, but it's like in those experiments where they put a rat in a cage and like it can hit this button and get food, or it can hit this button and get like cocaine water, and like it's going for the drugs every time, and it'll just hit that button and hit that button and hit that button. And I think that initiatory period where you feel like the universe has winked at you in particular, where like you feel like you are now at the center of some great unfolding, and that you have some important part of it, and that you're going to get to know, because that's kind of the headspace that people get into immediately after these kinds of events, that if people aren't willing to kind of move into the next phase of the hero's journey, which is just like fear and disorientation, right? And not knowing what your next move is. Yeah. Or you can be the rat in the cage and just keep hitting that button. And I think a lot of people get stuck there, and that it's like a real hazard in some ways of this kind of inquiry, is that you can literally make yourself crazy.
Yes, it happens. Yeah. Right. Okay. So do you mind if I do yet another passage from the book?
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah. So I'm on 236. Valet says, discussing the two hypotheses I presented above, I have shown that neither of them fully accounted for all the facts. I still feel that the UFO phenomenon represents a manifestation of a reality that transcends our current understanding of physics. It is not the phenomenon itself, but the belief that it has created, which is manipulated by human groups with their own objectivity. Because I'm going to come back to that, but end quote there. Interesting. So what Valet is saying there is saying, look, I don't think any of the going hypotheses, it's aliens, it's just us playing with our own technology, us meaning like an elite and military leader, something like that, playing with technology, etc. He thinks none of that actually explains what happens. And I agree with him. Like if you've looked into some of these cases, it is very difficult to explain this stuff in conventional terms, right? Even if you like do your best to like be ideologically critical of it and like this, like there's still this like kernel of like, wow, it does seem you can't fit this in, right? Okay. But what's interesting here, he says, yeah, but that being said, going back to that quote, it is not the phenomenon itself, but the belief it has created, which is manipulated by human groups with their own objectives. So I see that. So like he's saying, it's the manipulated hyperobject here, right? The ideology that speaks us rather than us speaking it. That's what's being manipulated, not this sort of real that people are running into. Okay, I think that's an important, and I think that's important for like Jared and my bearing to all these kinds of things. Is that right, Jared? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so now continuing with Valet, he says, I continue to be impressed by one fact I mentioned in my earlier book, Passport to Magonia. Such sightings have been made in earlier times. Similar effects have been described. Even the UFO occupants, once again he quotes there, appear identical to denizens of medieval Magonia. This suggests a reality of mind beyond whatever technology is activating UFO energy. I continue to regard this phenomena as a manifestation of a reality that is larger and more complex than a simple visit by interplanetary travelers, the reality of Magonia, end quote. Okay. Now, interesting there, we read a quote earlier where he referred to Magonia as a structure of the unconscious too, where he says like, we have dreams of fairies and goblins and ghosts and things like that, and then this phenomena like gives us a physical marker that licenses us to believe in our own dreams. Okay, so I think that it's interesting though. Like, so we can't really take Valet perfectly seriously that he's saying, oh, it turns out UFOs are elves, right? Or that they're goblins, or that they're the fairy folk. I think what he's saying is things had been reported as fairy folk are being reported now as UFOs. Do you see that? I think that's a very important thing to see here, right? And he's not putting his foot down on saying, oh, the medieval stories are true. He's not doing that, right? I think he's saying that there are structures of the human psyche, archetypes, if you will, that this triggers, okay? But that's not a description of what it is. It's something else, right?
Yeah, and I think that's so important because I think there's like a certain kind of criticism that's become the default in like academia and in the mainstream that has this kind of idea that like we are very enlightened and we see things as they are, and then we judge everyone else as being these kind of like backward idiots who were kind of making stuff up out of whole cloth whenever they ran up against something that they didn't understand. But like we are constantly also doing that, which is what this book is about. And it's 100%. About how when people through whatever mechanism are pushed kind of into the fringes, into the frontier of the known, that we have these same tendencies to just kind of like mythologize and to make things up and to believe very deeply in those things, and that those beliefs do have real weight and meaning and impact. And, you know, an example is I just got back from this academic workshop at the University of Exeter that was about the idea that plasma might be a substrate for intelligence or consciousness. And that would be a very huge deal because that's the fourth state of matter, and 99% of the visible universe is plasma. And so this idea that like plasma could be behind everything from, you know, UFOs to Sasquatch to fairies to angels to deep, you know what I mean? That could be what we're actually dealing with, I think is a really interesting idea. It also shows you how like nascent we are in all of this, right? That we're just getting around to talking about the stuff that like 99% of the things that we know about are made out of, right? And like we're just getting there. But then some of the
That's a great
conversations,
takeaway line there, Kelly. I like that. Yeah.
right? Like, we really don't know what we're talking about at all, right? But then you see, like, and this was a really cool conference because you had people like Robert Temple and Bernard Carr and Timothy Eastman and very legitimate scientists and astrophysicists and plasma scientists, and also like philosophy of mind guys and people who are into psychedelics and the holographic universe and and I was there for some reason. And, but some of the conversations that came out of that I thought were so important because, some of the people were asking, and I was so glad to hear people ask this, like, okay, but if all of this weird stuff, if we're just going to say that it can be explained by plasma, have we not just brought ourselves back to materialism? And like,
Yeah.
And like if that's okay, but like we need to support that if that's the case, you know what I mean? And also like just because it looks like it's intelligent, how do we actually know that plasma could be intelligent? Like what would that look like?
Yeah.
How do we in raising all of these larger questions? And so I just saw once again that tendency to fill this space where like, oh, plasma sounds like a great answer, and it's a great answer because we know nothing about it, and so we can really just sort of like project whatever we want onto this idea of plasma intelligence and feel like we've somehow arrived at an answer, but we haven't. We're just mythologizing.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that point you made there, Kelly. I think it's one of my stalking horses is this, like, things like materialism, idealism, I don't find it have any explanatory value whatsoever, right? Because I think they ultimately like amount to the same thing. Okay, like there's one stuff, right? Do you see what I mean? And it may be that humans are not good at ontology. Like that is a possibility here, right? And our attempts to have grand categorizations like that may just not be what we're set up to do, right? I'm open to that, right? And I think I love the point you made also, Kelly, is that look, the way I said, like, we all think everyone else has an unconscious but ourselves. Well, that's a historical thing too. We act like, oh yeah, prior generations, they were just the dupes of their own, needs for religious comfort or what have you. And now we're beyond that now that we've had the Enlightenment. And as if like somehow like we could like get by without the fundamental background structures of the human mind, and like we could exempt ourselves from it. Do you see what I mean? You know what I mean? And I think that's the important thing here is to say the same, and I actually said this in my book on it, is like the same scrutiny that we give to like classical religion, psychoanalytically, genealogically, right, critically, we need to give to everything else then too, right? Like no one gets a free pass on this. And whether it's our allegiance to contemporary science or our allegiance to something like ufology, what have you, it all has to be tested critically, not just scientifically, okay, but also in terms of what are the rudiments of our investment in it, right? Our emotional investment in it. That also needs to be explored. No less than we need to explore that for classical religion, right?
Yeah, and it's tough because there is no way to operate intellectually or even just in your day-to-day life without making some pretty hard epistemological commitments. Like you have to there's no way forward without it. And I think that like what's been so valuable to me about studying ufology and getting so deep into this, and in Valet's work in particular, is just this understanding that like I can't stop myself from doing that. I will do that, but that you have to find a way as much as possible to remain aware of the places where you're just like kind of mythologizing, where you're closing a gap without really having the means to support it, where you're like, well, that sounds right, or like that comports with what I believe to be true, so I choose to also believe that, like the becoming more aware of that. There's no way to do it perfectly, there's no way to not get caught up, but leaving that little bit of humility and openness there and being able to recognize what parts of your belief structure are manufactured or contingent, which is basically all of it turns out. Yeah. There's like these like small little kernels of like things I feel like I actually know to be true. And most of them don't transmit well to others. It's, coming back to gnosis, and it's complicated, and it's not comfortable, and it's not easy. This isn't fun. I have a friend who's an artist, and he told one of his classes he teaches at a university, his whole studio burned down, like his life's work. And, ever since then, he's told his students at the beginning of every year, like, if you can think of anything else in the world that would make you happy, you should go do that. Anything else. And I would actually say the same for ufology in some ways. Like, if you can think of anything else that would make you happy, you should go do that, because ufology is not going to be a thing that's going to make you happy.
I mean, I might say Kelly, that is a really profound, I think, encapsulation of a lot of what we're trying to achieve in the show. Is that I think that is true of any truly honest inquiry, right? If you are not open to a possible result that would make you very unhappy with things, right, then you're not actually engaged in inquiry, right? Yeah. And of course, we can never be sure of ourselves that we aren't rigging the game to avoid that dark conclusion. But I think this is what we call an imbecile in Zizhakian circles, is that it's someone who knows that we're constantly subject to our own unconscious subversions, and yet still goes forward attempting in a futile way to beat that, right? And so you're always going to have to go back to the beginning and start over, right? Because you can never really, really be sure of the ultimate motive that's holding you to this thing, right? And yet you have to try, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I like that a lot. Like, if there's anything else that would make you happier, right?
Or do it.
Or if it's not worth being unhappy to do this, then I think we can't really trust ourselves in doing it.
I completely agree. And our mutual friend, Daniel Elizondo, is someone that I really, really, really admire in this regard, because Daniel is our generation's Richard Dolan, and he's a brilliant, brilliant researcher. He's forgotten more about the history of this field than I'll ever know. And as a result of seeing so much, he's got some pretty dark takes on what's happening. But his
capital D on that dark, by the way.
Yes. Some of the darkest things I've ever heard of. And it's hard to know some of these things. And but Daniel is just one of the most joyful people I've ever met. He just loves it. He loves the whole thing. He's just do you see how crazy this is? Do you see how absurd it is? And he just kind of runs toward it and does it with just without judgment for the people that he's learning these horrible things about, and with just a bottomless well of just curiosity and just wanting to understand and to connect the dots, that I really admire that. I try to be more like Daniel.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. So probably we're getting up to an hour here, and I know Jared does have a legitimate job.
Boo.
I am a lazy academic who's never worked a damn day in his life, so I'm okay. But so I want to be respectful of time. Kelly, do you have any takeaway for our audience?
I would just say that I love what you're doing with this podcast. I think that there are so many dangerous books, and I joke often in ufology, I think this applies to really any community, that the best place to hide information from the UFO community is in a book. Because I think a lot of people buy them maybe as decoration or so they can snap a pic of it and put it on their Instagram. But it just becomes so obvious to me all the time that people aren't actually reading these books. And, it's one thing.
I understand, friend.
Right. Yeah. You're fighting the fight every day, I'm sure. And I would really encourage people to do that. I think Valet in particular is somebody that gets all kinds of lip service, but by the way he's being discussed or not discussed, I recognize that almost everyone who's talking about Valet has not read Valet and hasn't taken the time to understand his body of work, what he's trying to say. And that's just one person, start there. But I mean, I think that if you're trying to shortcut your way, or I hate to say it, podcast your way to like listening to podcasts to, understanding some of these deeper concepts. Like this stuff can help and can provide you a roadmap, but like you really have got to do the work yourself. And I hope that people, right. I hope that people aren't just listening to you guys talk about these great, dangerous books. I hope that they crack some of them. Probably your audience is not the choir. I'm preaching to the choir here, but I do hope that more people in general are cracking these books and giving them a look.
Yeah. And I like that too. Like maybe, would you agree, Kelly, that like, if you're going to jump into this like cesspool, maybe of study, Messengers of Deception, good first foot in.
Yeah, I think you should start there, because I think too, I wish I hadn't waited so long to consider which parts of this were human.
Yeah.
Like the UFO really is this kind of blank canvas on which you can project all kinds of beliefs and suppositions and hopes and dreams. But there's a lot of this stuff that the phenomenon, the modern phenomenon as we know it, is inextricably tied up in the technology and politics and power plays of the last 80 or so years, and you can't understand it outside of that. Any understanding of the phenomenon that you have divorced of those things is just another fairy tale.
Yeah. And this book will give you a good BS detector as you enter that field of study. I agree. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Jared, you got a takeaway today? Maybe we have to start having end of show takeaways.
Yeah, I just think that, similar to what we've been talking about, this whole show is about trying to wake people up to the fact that there are forces at work that are both external and internal to you potentially being manipulated. And so we want people to be able to think for themselves, step outside of that box. And part of the reason we've been starting with a lot of essays is just because we want people to actually read these things.
Yeah.
Like invite them to a 15-page essay, and then we'll get into the larger works as we go. But yeah, I really appreciated having you here on the show, Kelly. It's been really wonderful to connect with you and to chat with you. Thank you for everything you do, for sure. So thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you. It was such a pleasure. I'll do it anytime.
Jared, we've utterly failed in restraint on that with SART, though. Like we're going to do like 2 chapters, and it just turned out to be
yes.
Right. We're not disciplined, man. I guess my takeaway would be, look, like you too have an unconscious. Okay. And be wary of that. Like be wary of yourself first and foremost. Be aware of yourself first and foremost, because without that, you will get sucked into things unawares. Yeah. I think that's important. Kelly, anything you want to plug?
We have,
if I may put it crassly. Yeah.
Yes, no, we've got a bunch of new content coming up on Cosmosis. People can check that out. We're switching to like a much more kind of like video in the field style. I'm actually just today about to go out and start shooting a bunch of new stuff with my creative partner, J. Christopher King, because we're kind of tired of all of the narrative wars and the all the things that happen in this space, and we're trying to just get back out into the field where weird things are happening to people, and trying to get as close to the signal as possible. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple months, and you'll see that all rolling out on the podcast, and I'm really excited for people to see what we're working on.
Cool. Awesome. I'm sure we will check back in with you at some point here.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Dangerous, great books.
I'd love that.
Cool. All right, man.
All right. Well, great episode.
Great episode. Yeah. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.